Part 1. The Dark Ages. Uncovering the era's biggest secrets for sleep. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight, we begin with a gentle drift back in time, to a period most people call dark. Not the moody kind of dark, with mysterious shadows and secret societies, but more of the we have very little idea what people were doing, and it mostly involved a lot of mud, boiled cabbage, and plague kind of dark. So, if you've got your blanket tucked just right, maybe a warm drink at your side, and your phone on silent, let's wander lazily through what historians politely refer to as the Dark Ages, or, as everyone else calls it when trying to sound impressive at cocktail parties, early medieval Europe, roughly 500 to 1000 AD, because why not label 800 years with a single vague phrase? Now, the Dark Ages weren't completely dark. There were still people reading, writing, building, and occasionally getting themselves executed for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But records are sparse, dusty, and often written by monks who had a very specific sense of humor. That is, they mostly liked to record the deaths, the misfortunes, and the peculiar habits of kings. And kings, it turns out, were particularly good at being peculiar. So, let's float over to one of the first royal disasters in this period. We have King Childebert II of Austrasia. He became king at a very tender age, mostly because his father died before he could really figure out taxes, diplomacy, or hair grooming. Childebert was 6. Yes, 6. Of course, he was technically king, but you can imagine that a 6-year-old running a kingdom is more of a ceremonial thing. The real power resided with regents and advisors, who probably had a lot of quiet arguments about who got to sit closest to the soup pot at dinner. Childebert is mostly remembered for having a very tragic, short life, and a royal lineage that, like a lot of Frankish dynasties, didn't care much for genetic diversity. Cousins married cousins, siblings sometimes married siblings, because why not double down on family loyalty at the expense of facial symmetry? The Frankish nobility seemed to enjoy watching how many ways they could twist a family tree into something resembling a particularly stubborn knot. Moving slightly west, we meet King Offa of Mercia. Offa ruled in the latter half of the 8th century. He's often called the real founder of England, but if you ask the average person, they probably think of vague kings in robes, maybe with a crown too heavy for their head. Offa is notable not just for his diplomatic alliances, but for his obsessive control over coinage. He issued coins, then issued slightly different coins, then issued even more coins, because controlling the money was apparently very soothing. It's said he corresponded with Charlemagne, who may have been equally fascinated by slightly overcomplicated accounting. But Offa's domestic life was less about coins and more about managing his sprawling, occasionally feuding, family. Royal children back then had the remarkable ability to die young or to survive and develop questionable behavioral patterns. Offa's descendants illustrate this quite vividly, as later Mercian kings were not known for their charm, good looks, or consistency in governance. Imagine a royal family reunion where everyone's eye twitch slightly, and you'll get the right idea. By now, you might be feeling drowsy, and that's perfect, because the next figure is almost guaranteed to deepen that gentle sleep. King Æthelred the Unready, who ruled England centuries later, is a classic example of what happens when royal upbringing meets chaotic times. Unready doesn't mean he showed up late for council meetings or forgot to comb his hair. It comes from the Old English unread, meaning poor counsel, which is just a polite way of saying bad at making decisions, frequently advised by equally confused people. Æthelred is famous for a few things. 1. Marrying people he didn't necessarily like. 2. Issuing laws that rarely worked. And 3. Signing treaties that usually ended in more Viking invasions. His reign was a non-stop parade of minor disasters, bureaucratic headaches, and personal melancholy. Imagine sitting at a candlelit table, signing a document that ensures your kingdom will probably be raided in the next season, and sighing softly into your quill. That was Æthelred, a king who perfectly embodies the slightly tragic, mildly incompetent, very human vibe we're floating toward tonight. If you're still awake, let's drift into Charlemagne's court, which was technically slightly later than the Dark Ages proper, but feels relevant because dynasties loved repeating their mistakes. Charlemagne had over 18 children, though some accounts suggest even he lost track. Royal children in this era were mostly raised to continue dynastic ambitions, which meant strict diets, limited freedom, and plenty of rote learning. There were also frequent incidents of jealousy among siblings, which sometimes resulted in exiles, minor rebellions, or awkward public spats that would make today's reality TV seem understated. Charlemagne's family dynamics were less about affection and more about survival, status, and producing heirs who wouldn't immediately die or go insane. Because, let's face it, early medieval Europe didn't exactly have robust child health care or psychological support. If a child had a weak constitution, that was considered a mildly inconvenient fact of life rather than a medical emergency. Now, as we gently float over to Carolingian France, we find one of my favorite oddly specific royal habits. Louis the Pious, Charlemagne's son, was notably anxious about sin. He would frequently confess, fast excessively, and generally obsess over his soul, while his kingdom slowly descended into petty civil war among his sons. It's a remarkable image, a middle-aged emperor pacing his castle corridors in slippers, muttering prayers, while his children form minor armies and argue over provinces. The contrast between the spiritual seriousness of the father and the mischievous ambition of the sons is so stark it almost feels like watching a sleepy cartoon. Louis is also remembered for being extraordinarily polite in writing, especially in charters and official documents, which perhaps served as a soothing distraction from the fact that everyone was constantly plotting to take his title away. In other words, early medieval monarchy: high anxiety, low sleep, endless paperwork. Of course, the Dark Ages weren't just about kings. Nobles and minor aristocrats provided endless material for gentle amusement, or mild existential dread, if you prefer. Many nobles spent their lives acquiring land, marrying multiple cousins, and keeping track of who owed them which chicken or sack of grain. Records often note deaths from natural causes, which in this period could mean anything from spoiled food to mild fever. Disease, famine, and poor hygiene were constants, but somehow Europeans managed to survive, marry into their own family repeatedly, and occasionally.
Part 2. Royal Oddities and Inherited Misfortunes. All right, welcome back. If you've managed to keep your eyes open through the gentle chaos of early medieval Europe, tonight we continue our drift through the oddly tragic, mildly bizarre, and quietly unsettling world of Dark Ages royalty. Let's not rush. After all, these stories are best savored slowly, like lukewarm mead by a dimly flickering candle. Tonight, we're going to linger among royal families, the ever-present specter of inbreeding, and the strange tiny disasters that seem to haunt every throne. Let's begin with the Merovingian dynasty of the Franks. Now, the Merovingians were fondly referred to as the long-haired kings, which was less about fashion and more about a symbolic nod to their supposed divine right to rule. Long hair was a power move, though given the hygiene standards of the time, it might have been a bit itchy as well. What makes the Merovingians fascinating and gently tragic is their obsession with keeping the bloodline pure. Cousins married cousins, nephews married nieces, and occasionally someone looked like a half-baked Habsburg potato. They weren't trying to be cruel or cruelly ironic. It just seemed sensible to them. Unfortunately, genetic consequences didn't check with dynastic ambitions. Several Merovingian kings were chronically sickly, mentally unsteady, or prone to unpredictable behavior. An enduring testament to the "sometimes you regret a family reunion" school of thought. Take Clothar II, for example. He became king of Neustria at a young age, like many of his relatives, and lived in a world where regents handled most governance. Clothar's childhood was punctuated by strange guardianship arrangements, sudden deaths of cousins, and court intrigue that was mostly boring but had minor consequences for dinner arrangements. He eventually unified the Frankish kingdoms, but not without generating plenty of sleepy historical footnotes about family feuds, minor territorial disputes, and slightly awkward marriages. One might imagine him pacing corridors in the dead of night, wondering if anyone noticed how messy royal correspondence had become, all while the rest of the family plotted minor annoyances. If you gently shift your attention east, we encounter the Byzantine Empire, which, despite its fancy palaces and silk trade, had dynastic drama that rivals any medieval soap opera. Consider Emperor Constantine VII, sometimes called the Purple-born, because he literally grew up in the purple, meaning he was born in the imperial palace, surrounded by velvet and intrigue. His early life involved guardianship by regents who were more interested in controlling the empire than in teaching him to tie his sandals correctly. Constantine eventually ruled as emperor, though for much of his youth he was technically a very well-dressed hostage of the court. His life is a study of aristocratic peculiarities. He loved books, he loved learning, and he had a habit of writing lengthy treatises about court protocol. Meanwhile, his family schemed, plotted, and occasionally forced marriages, as aristocratic families always do. It's a comforting thought. Even emperors had boring paperwork and slightly inconvenient relatives. Let's float gently over to Charles the Simple, King of West Francia. He inherited a kingdom that, like most at the time, was a mix of largely autonomous nobles, poorly enforced laws, and occasional Viking raiders. Charles was fond of somewhat optimistic decisions, such as granting land to anyone who showed up and promised loyalty. Unsurprisingly, loyalty was in short supply, and Charles's reign is remembered less for conquests and more for a series of mild embarrassments, dethronements, and awkward family arguments. He married his first wife, then his second, and somehow always found time to make minor mistakes that would frustrate future historians. Charles's story is the archetypal sleepy medieval narrative. Slight mismanagement, brief periods of prosperity, a little intrigue, and always the looming risk of being deposed by your own cousin. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, we find Harald Fairhair, sometimes considered Norway's first king. Harald's life was marked by ambition, persistent hair obsession, yes, the fair hair moniker was literal, and complicated family arrangements. He had so many children, reportedly dozens, that keeping track of succession was an exhausting game of musical thrones. Some children were legitimate, some were not, and most were eventually exiled to prevent awkward sibling rebellions. Harold's approach to rulership demonstrates a recurring Dark Ages theme. Dynastic ambition often trumps everything else, including comfort, morality, or occasionally, logic. You can almost picture him at a dinner table, quietly counting his offspring while muttering under his breath about the likelihood of peaceful succession. Of course, the British Isles had their fair share of similarly sleepy dynastic oddities. Take Edgar the Peaceful, King of England in the 10th century. He earned his nickname because, for once, he avoided most major wars. Which, if you think about it, is remarkable for the period. Edgar was more focused on ceremonial correctness, managing the church and occasionally exiling sons who misbehaved. He also had some rather peculiar habits, like insisting that all nobles attend public assemblies fully robed and slightly uncomfortable because appearances mattered, even if nobody really knew why. Edgar's reign is an excellent example of mild stability. Everything mostly worked, minor irritations persisted, and the royal household remained a quiet source of intrigue and familial annoyance. Speaking of familial annoyance, let's drift southward to Italy and the Lombard kings. Desiderius, king of the Lombards in the 8th century, was an archetypal example of someone who wanted everything: land, influence, titles, and frequently forgot that ambition occasionally outruns practicality. Desiderius married strategically, plotted carefully, and made minor but repeated errors in diplomacy. These errors didn't lead to spectacular disasters, just slightly awkward historical footnotes, which is perfect for a sleepy narrative. Imagine Desiderius in his palace, sipping wine and sighing softly over a map of Europe, quietly wondering which neighboring king would send a mildly inconvenient letter next. That's the pace we're aiming for tonight. Soft intrigue, muted drama, and the ever-present quiet hum of courtly life. Now, if we wander over to the Iberian Peninsula, the Visigothic kings provide another delightful example of gentle chaos. Euric, one of the earlier Visigothic rulers, spent much of his life consolidating power, issuing laws, and slightly alarming his neighbors. Visigothic law codes were complex and occasionally contradictory, which means kings like Euric were constantly checking, double-checking, and sometimes sighing with quiet frustration over minor legal inconsistencies. Family life, too, was generally confusing. Cousins, uncles, nephews, and occasionally a surprise sibling all had claims to wealth and influence. These minor dramas rarely led to bloodshed on a cinematic scale, but they created endless monotony for historians and slightly drowsy fascination for modern readers. Returning gently to Frankish lands, we encounter the Robertians, ancestors of the Capians. They are a classic example of mild dynastic absurdity. Constantly intermarrying, managing brief kingdoms, and quietly losing battles of minor importance. Hugh Capet, who eventually founded the Capian dynasty, started life surrounded by siblings, distant cousins, and a constant stream of advisors muttering about taxes, titles, and whether the horses were fed properly. Hugh's book was less about glory and more about quietly navigating a complex web of minor obligations, small inheritances, and slightly awkward family dinners. Which, if you think about it, is a perfect model for the Dark Ages: dynastic ambition, endless paperwork, and the occasional awkward family conflict. Speaking of awkward family conflict, let's linger for a moment on Lothar II, King of Lotharingia. His life is particularly interesting from the perspective of royal melodrama. Lothar married his wife, Tutberga, then spent years attempting to annul the marriage in favor of a mistress, all while managing the constant.
Part 3. The Quiet Tragedies and Oddities of Medieval Royals. Welcome back. By now, you're probably comfortably settled, possibly sipping something warm, and ready to drift further into the slow-moving river of early medieval Europe. Tonight, we continue our gentle exploration of royal eccentricities, family quirks, and the endless parade of dynastic misadventures that make the Dark Ages so quietly mesmerizing. Let's float lazily over the next cluster of kings and queens, who lived lives defined less by conquest and more by minor disasters, odd habits, and the occasional slightly tragic decision. Let's begin with King Edward the Elder of England, son of Æthelred the Great. Edward inherited a kingdom that was fragmented, occasionally raided by Vikings, and populated by nobles with a remarkable talent for complaining. Edward spent much of his reign quietly consolidating power, issuing laws, and marrying strategically. His domestic life, however, offers a perfect example of minor royal melancholy. Edward's children were numerous, as royal children often are, and each came with the usual mix of ambition, illness, and occasionally questionable temperament. He would gently supervise the household, perhaps sighing softly at minor disputes, while occasionally writing letters to nobles who had the audacity to disagree with him. It's a charmingly repetitive, mildly tragic picture. Kings quietly exhausted by the ongoing obligations of dynastic life. Drifting eastward to the Frankish world, we meet Louis the Stammerer, son of Charles the Bald. Louis is remembered less for conquest and more for a quiet, personal awkwardness. His stammer made public speaking slightly difficult, though he managed to rule West Francia for a time. Family life was, as usual, a mixture of minor intrigue and carefully arranged marriages. Louis's sons, successors to the throne, inherited a kingdom that was stable enough to exist, but constantly flirting with minor disasters. Picture Louis pacing corridors, softly correcting a scribe, muttering about the weather, and quietly worrying about succession. Nothing dramatic happens, just the gentle hum of aristocratic responsibility, perfect for a slow evening of historical drift. Meanwhile, in the Iberian Peninsula, the Asturian kings provide their own brand of subtle fascination. Alfonso III, known as the Great, spent his reign consolidating territory, defending borders, and managing children who were occasionally more interested in rebellion than obedience. The Asturian court was small, quiet, and full of minor intrigue, disputes over inheritance, disagreements about land, and slightly eccentric requests from the king himself. Alfonso's domestic life was, in the words of the historian who we wish had been a little less verbose, a mildly complicated but ultimately uneventful series of family negotiations, which, as bedtime history goes, is perfect. Nothing too jarring, just the gentle rhythm of inherited responsibility and occasional royal exasperation. If we turn our attention to Italy, the Lombard kings continued to provide subtle amusement. Liutprand, for example, was fond of issuing long, polite letters to other rulers, full of courteous phrasing and slightly unnecessary explanations. His reign was stable, mostly, but punctuated by family disagreements and minor rebellions. Liutprand's personal habits, as recorded, were diligent but occasionally peculiar. He reportedly insisted on a specific order for meals and strict adherence to court etiquette. These tiny eccentricities offer a soothing picture of medieval aristocracy, ceremonial, repetitive, and occasionally exasperating, but never truly catastrophic. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire offers us Basil I, founder of the Macedonian dynasty. Basil's life is a masterclass in slightly dramatic but ultimately sleep-inducing dynastic intrigue. He rose from humble beginnings, worked his way into imperial favor, and eventually became emperor. His reign was filled with careful management of ambitious relatives, meticulous court ceremonies, and the ever-present worry about succession. Basil had children who were occasionally spoiled, sometimes rebellious, and often a source of quiet headaches. Imagine him in a sunlit palace corridor, gently sighing while counting sons and plotting minor administrative reforms. History records him as competent but occasionally irritable, which, in the gentle monotone of our bedtime story, is exactly the right amount of tension. Across the Channel, in Wessex, the story of Æthelstan, often called the first king of all England, continues our theme of mild dynastic complexity. Æthelstan was deeply concerned with law, order, and minor ceremonial correctness. He married carefully, collected relics, and oversaw children who would later carry on the sleepy business of ruling a fragmented kingdom. His reign is remarkable for its lack of dramatic personal disaster, which is precisely why it lulls us gently. A competent ruler, quietly managing obligations, dealing with family irritations, and occasionally worrying about the weather in a slightly dramatic fashion. Drifting back toward Frankish lands, Charles the Bald offers us yet another gently tragic tale. Charles inherited West Francia in a state of minor chaos, rebellious nobles, occasionally mismanaged provinces, and a family that was a constant source of worry. Charles married twice, had numerous children, and spent most of his reign navigating the quiet, exhausting drama of royal life. There were battles, treaties, and minor territorial disputes, but nothing that would shock a modern viewer. Instead, we observe a king quietly worn down by paperwork, correspondence, and the subtle frustration of having ambitious children. It's an oddly comforting image, royalty as slow-moving human machinery turning endlessly under the soft weight of inheritance and obligation. Meanwhile, the Carolingian dynasty produced Louis the German, a man whose life was less about epic conquest and more about gentle administrative headaches. Louis ruled East Francia, managed his siblings' ambitions, and supervised children who were often more interested in rebellion than obedience. His court was filled with advisors, minor nobles, and clerics, all gently sighing over letters, treaties, and occasionally an awkward feast. Louis's personal life offers a calming pattern, minor frustrations, slightly spoiled children, and a steady rhythm of dynastic maintenance. You can almost hear the soft rustle of parchment and the occasional sigh echoing down the corridors of his palace. Now, let's drift south to Spain and the Kingdom of Navarre. Navarre's monarchs often lived lives that were politically complex, but personally quiet. Sancho III, for example, spent his reign consolidating territories, arranging marriages, and quietly enduring the minor irritations of family and nobility. He married multiple times for political convenience, fathered numerous children, and occasionally dealt with minor rebellions. Nothing particularly catastrophic happened, just a slow accumulation of responsibilities and slightly awkward domestic arrangements. Perfect for bedtime reflection. Soft, persistent human ambition, gently unfolding over decades. Returning to the Byzantines, Leo VI, known as the Wise, spent his reign carefully codifying laws, managing family disputes, and trying to ensure his children had a marginally better chance at survival than previous emperors. His domestic life was punctuated by minor quarrels, ceremonial obligations, and the occasional awkward love affair. Leo's careful attention to detail, combined with slightly eccentric personal habits like a fondness for lengthy chronicles, creates a subtle, calming portrait. A ruler deeply concerned with correctness, slightly exasperated with the world, but ultimately enduring. Across the Channel again, in England, the story of Edgar the Peaceful continues to lull gently. Edgar oversaw his kingdom with mild diligence, ensured that his nobles attended ceremonies properly, and quietly managed succession for his children. His reign, relatively free from large-scale disaster, is perfect for bedtime contemplation, minor irritations, occasional disputes, and the slow, comforting rhythm of dynastic life.
Meanwhile, Charles the Simple offers another example of quiet mismanagement. He inherited a kingdom fraught with ambitious nobles and occasional Viking incursions. Charles attempted treaties, marriages, and other minor solutions, often with mixed results. His personal life included the usual succession concerns, occasional exile of offspring, and gentle disappointment with the unpredictability of human ambition. Nothing explosive happens. Instead, we observe a softly chaotic kingdom managed with patience, occasional exasperation, and a steady hand. Finally, we drift over to the Holy Roman Empire and Otto I again. Otto's life is interesting because it combines competence with gentle eccentricity. He managed rebellions, negotiated treaties, and supervised children, all with a mild but persistent sense of duty. His personal habits, including careful attention to court protocol.
Part 4. Gentle Endings and the Last Whispers of Dark Age Royalty. Welcome back to our final gentle drift through the Dark Ages. By now, you've traveled through centuries of minor intrigue, slightly tragic dynasties, and the slow hum of medieval life. Tonight, we will conclude our journey by lingering over more royals, curious personal habits, and the subtle dramas that defined their quiet, imperfect lives. Settle in, allow your eyes to grow heavy, and let history lull you to sleep one final time. Let's begin with King Hugh Capet, founder of the Capetian dynasty in France. Hugh is a fascinating case because he embodies quiet competence rather than spectacular disaster. He inherited a patchwork of territories, some barely loyal, some openly grumpy, and some mildly inconvenient. Hugh's domestic life was filled with children, cousins, and slightly ambitious neighbors, all of whom had claims or complaints. He married carefully, not necessarily for love, but for the gentle stability of dynastic continuity. Hugh spent much of his reign quietly consolidating power, managing minor rebellions, and ensuring that his offspring would inherit a kingdom less chaotic than those of his predecessors. Imagine him quietly surveying his lands, mildly exasperated by minor disputes over taxes, land, and who got the bigger slice of bread at family dinners. Perfectly soothing for bedtime reflection. Moving eastward to the Holy Roman Empire, we revisit Otto II, son of Otto I. Otto II inherited a realm still stabilizing from his father's careful management. His personal life, however, was slightly less calm. He married a Byzantine princess, bringing exotic tastes, minor ceremonial complexities, and, naturally, children who would continue the gentle cycle of dynastic ambition. Otto II's reign involved negotiating with rebellious nobles, supervising distant provinces, and occasionally dealing with mildly inconvenient invasions. His children were taught etiquette, strategy, and the subtle art of sighing politely when faced with family quarrels. The slow rhythm of responsibility and slightly chaotic familial life provides a perfect image for drifting further toward sleep. Meanwhile, in England, Æthelred the Unready, our old acquaintance, offers a gently tragic story. As previously mentioned, unready comes from unread, meaning poor counsel. Æthelred's reign was filled with minor disasters, treaties that didn't work, Viking raids that were mostly inconvenient but persistent, and children who would continue the slightly messy work of succession.
Æthelred himself had a reputation for overthinking, excessive paperwork, and mild despair at the ineffectiveness of royal directives. Imagine him at a candlelit desk, sighing quietly over letters from anxious nobles, muttering softly about what went wrong, and occasionally misplacing a seal or a quill. The combination of effort, failure, and persistence is oddly comforting, a lullaby of bureaucratic medieval life. Let's float toward the Iberian Peninsula again, where the Kingdom of Leon offers another soothing narrative of minor intrigue. Ordoño II managed children, inheritance disputes, and occasional skirmishes with neighbors, all without excessive drama. He married carefully, oversaw the collection of taxes, and generally ensured that his kingdom operated at a slow, methodical pace. Royal life in Leon was about repetition, modest ambition, and the gentle tug-of-war between authority and family dynamics. There were no epic battles to disrupt sleep, just a continuous, soothing rhythm of obligations, minor frustrations, and slightly spoiled airs. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire had its share of quietly dramatic personalities. Constantine VII, who grew up surrounded by regents, spent his reign balancing ceremonial duties, minor revolts, and the constant supervision of children, grandchildren, and distant relatives. Constantine loved learning, chronicling events, and occasionally writing treatises on court etiquette. The slow cadence of his life, punctuated by minor intrigues and gentle exasperation with his relatives, offers the perfect contrast to the chaos of earlier centuries. Here we see the rhythm of slow historical continuity, a soft hum that soothes rather than excites. If we drift northwest, Iberian minor kingdoms such as Navarre and Aragon provide examples of royal eccentricities that are quietly entertaining. Sancho III of Navarre, for example, had multiple children, each carefully groomed to inherit titles and lands. His domestic life involved gentle rivalries among sons, carefully arranged marriages, and the occasional minor rebellion. Nothing escalated into epic tragedy. It was just the persistent, low-level drama of dynastic maintenance. Soft sighs of bureaucratic effort echo through the historical record, a calming lull of duty, expectation, and slightly spoiled offspring. Returning to Frankish lands, Louis IV of France, often called Louis d'Outre-mer, spent much of his reign managing minor disputes among nobles, marrying strategically, and overseeing children who were perpetually mildly inconvenient. Louis's life was punctuated by minor setbacks, small territorial disagreements, and the subtle anxieties of inheritance. In many ways, he represents the gentle pulse of the Dark Ages, kings who were human, occasionally exasperated, and mostly enduring. His quiet diligence is almost hypnotic when read aloud in the monotone rhythm we are using tonight. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, Harald Bluetooth of Denmark provides a gentle contrast. Famous mostly for consolidating Denmark and introducing Christianity, Harald's domestic life was filled with children, marriages, and the occasional disagreement among nobles. His personal habits, slightly peculiar, included a fondness for monumental stones and inscriptions, likely intended to impress posterity. The combination of mild ambition, family complexity, and slightly eccentric projects paints a soothing, almost sleepy picture of early medieval Scandinavian royalty. Let's not forget Louis V of France, the last Carolingian king of West Francia. Louis's reign was brief, his children non-existent, and his rule largely ceremonial by the time he ascended. He spent most of his life quietly observing court politics, dealing with mildly exasperating nobles, and occasionally being overshadowed by more capable relatives. Louis's life is a gentle example of fleeting power, subtle dynastic fragility, and the quiet inevitability of historical change. Nothing dramatic disturbs the narrative, just a slow fade of one dynasty and the gentle rise of another. Now, as we float toward the final examples, we meet Boleslav I of Poland, often called Boleslav the Brave. Boleslav was energetic, but his domestic life contained all the expected elements: children, minor rebellions, arranged marriages, and slightly inconvenient neighbors. His reign involved consolidating territories, supervising minor nobles, and managing family expectations. The daily rhythm of royal duties, tax collection, diplomacy, ceremonies is what history preserves, and for bedtime reading, it is perfectly hypnotic. Finally, we linger on the quiet, slightly tragic patterns that dominate medieval aristocracy. Across all kingdoms, from the Frankish heartlands to Iberian principalities, from England to Scandinavia, the lives of kings